When Eden came to, she was upside down and bouncing off of someone's muscular back. Her eyes opened to darkness. A thick black fabric covered her entire head, and she tried to remind herself to breathe slowly, to not let the fabric choke her. It was a struggle to keep her body limp as she slowly came back into herself, but it was worth the fight. He hadn't noticed yet that she had woken. He carried her roughly slung over his shoulder. Like a sack of potatoes, he didn't care about bruising. Lucas. Where was he taking her? How long had they been walking? She could hear his labored breathing, but in the darkness and through the fog of her brain, it was impossible to tell how long she'd been out. Her head ached. Every movement that jostled her was a firework exploding behind her eyes. A wave of nausea rushed through her. Clamping her lips tight, she fought the vomit down again. It would help no one to puke inside her own fabric prison. It was hard to think. Everything was fuzzy, and without her sight or smell or feet on the ground, she was helpless. It felt like a lifetime, punctuated by pains sharp and lasting, that he trundled along with her bouncing over his shoulder. He stumbled, pitching forward violently before he caught himself, and Eden couldn't help but groan in agony. "Good morning," he said. "Not much farther now."
"Hang die."
She said nothing, gritting her teeth against his voice. He spoke to her as if she was a friend, as if he hadn't just knocked her unconscious and stolen her. He spoke to her as if they were not enemies. The idea filled Eden with more rage than her bruised body could comfortably contain. It filled her throat with vile insults that she fought not to fling at him. Not yet. Not until she knew where she was. Not until she could see and defend herself. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her body in a shuddering gasp. Lucas had dropped her, without word or warning, and she curled inward on herself, gasping to catch her breath. Her heartbeat was pounding in her ears, and she braced herself for whatever pain was coming next. The beating never came. Slowly, with trembling hands that she realized were numb because they were bound with rope, she pulled the hood from her head. It was dark, and she was alone. The only light in the small room came from a window set high in the steel door. It was the soft glow of incandescent lighting, coming in from the lit hallway beyond. She blinked several times, head pounding each time, as she struggled to get her bearings. The floor was a rough patchwork of steel sheeting, welded and bolted together with raised seams. The walls were the same, steel and bolted together by an amateur by the looks of it, seams crooked and the bolts irregular. The air was musty and stale, unrecycled and unpurified. She shivered, whether from the cold or something else. "Hello," she called. There was no answer. Her voice bounced back at her and reverberated through her own skull. Her hands, bound together tightly, were pale from the loss of circulation. Her feet, she discovered when she tried to stand, were bound together as well, and bare. He'd taken her boots, most likely to discourage her from running. As she took stock, sitting pressed up against the far wall of the cell, Eden worked at the knot binding her feet. Her feet tingled as the rope came loose, and the blood rushed back into them. She gasped with relief, but there was no time to relax. She set to chewing at the bindings of her wrists. The rope, tight as it was mercifully thin, old, and already frayed. Lucas was a member of the hive, that much she suspected. But why her? What value could she possibly have to the hive? She took a break to spit rope fibers from her mouth, halfway through the bindings. She had nothing to offer them. Finally, her teeth cut through the last strand of rope, and she rubbed her hands together, trying desperately to win back the circulation. She cursed. The blood stung as it rushed back into her fingers. The window at the top of the door was high enough that she imagined she could stand on her tiptoes and crane her neck to see out of it. Eden groaned as she got to her feet, stumbling a bit as she got her balance, and wondered again how long she'd been unconscious and bound. A long hallway stretched in either direction. A patchwork of rusted and tarnished steel sheets were bolted together to make up the walls and flooring. Strip lights lined the corners where the wall met the floor or ceiling. After about 10 meters in either direction, the halls turned sharply away, in either direction from what Eden could tell. The sections she could see were broken up regularly by other steel doors with slotted windows. "Hello? Anyone else down here?" she called through the window, her voice echoing back at her from every direction. Her echoes faded to silence. Eden tried to feel some comfort that the other steel doors apparently held no other prisoners. Alone, in the dark and the damp. "I know you're down here," she shouted, more forcefully, almost offended by the lack of guards. "Cowards! Show yourselves! Anyone!" No response. "Cowards!" she whispered again. Eden sank back to the floor, leaning backwards against the door. The broken rope and her hood lay crumpled in a pile in the center of the room. It wasn't much of a room, really, now that she was looking around. She stretched her sore legs out in front of her, and her toes came close to brushing the opposite wall. She could almost feel the kiss of steel on her fingertips if she were to open her arms out wide. How long had she been down here? Eden took a deep, shaking breath, trying not to choke on the stale air and willing her racing heart to settle. Rory would notice she was missing, sooner rather than later. He'd know, somehow, what had happened. He wouldn't let her become one of the missing, like Alex Jepson. She had to be deep in the old mines. It was the only place that made sense to be this damp, dark, and stale. In the beginning, in the early days of Haven, the city had worked the mines, searching for gold or other precious metals. Nothing but bad luck beneath the surface. As the ground refused to yield its treasure, and instead claimed several lives due to the unstable mines, they sealed it up and put in support beams where necessary. And, some said, off-site research labs. Off-site, secretive research. Those were the rumors. Everyone knew the mines were simply too unstable to stay in. Clever, Eden had to admit. The Cards and the city police had poked around in the upper levels of the mines, but deemed it unlikely that anyone had made their home further down, even a radical terrorist group. The danger of exploration wasn't worth the risk, and common theory was that the Hive operated a moving base throughout the city, always one step ahead of everyone else. They weren't one step ahead. They were miles below. It was impossible to track the passage of time in the unchanging, unnatural twilight of her cell. Time passed, despite Eden's best efforts, but eventually she heard heavy footsteps, the sound echoing off the walls. She counted the footsteps as they came closer and closer towards her cell. She didn't know if she hoped they stopped or continued past her. Suddenly, her mouth was dry and her hands were damp with sweat. She moved away from the door and instead crouched against the far wall facing the tiny window of light. She tried to make her posture look as nonchalant as possible. The steps slowed outside the door. Eden held her breath and wondered if her visitor could hear her heart thumping. The door swung open jerkily, the hinges ungreased and complaining loudly. Eden waited, her body tense and coiled against the wall like a spring, waiting to pounce. What? Eden launched forward with all her might, throwing herself towards the man who had let himself into the cell and still held the door open wide. It was Lucas, she realized as she tried to dodge around him. He filled most of the doorway, but she ducked beneath his arm and stepped out into the hallway, exhilaration and adrenaline moving her forwards until she was yanked backwards by her ponytail and thrown back into the corner of her cell, pain blossoming again in her back of her head. "You don't want to fight me, Eden," Lucas said. "Just hang out and listen for a minute." "You don't know what I want," she growled. Eden could taste blood in her mouth. She'd bit her lip when she hit the wall. "How do you know me? What do you want with me? Who are you?" If she couldn't get past him, maybe she could get something out of them. Lucas crouched in front of her, elbows on his knees, cocking his head at her curiously. There was not an abundance of malice in his eyes, but he did look fairly annoyed. "I'm Lucas," he said. "I told you that already. Now, tell me everything you know about paradisium." Paradisium. The same strange word from Rory's report, the one that had made him so angry. Her eyes widened. What was he involved in? She let the surprise pass through her and tried to let it go, trying to keep her face a neutral mask. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "What is that?" He raised one bushy eyebrow. "I think you know what it is. You're close with Dr. Lawrence. We already know this. Tell me what you know about paradisium, what Dr. Lawrence is working on. Start talking. I don't want to have to hurt you again." She mustered all her strength and took aim. Eden spat in his face, an equal mix of blood and saliva. She braced herself, waiting for the blow to come. Hal would have knocked her backwards for that. Lucas stared at her, shock on his face. "No dinner tonight, I suppose," he said, wiping his face. "No one will find you here, Eden. No one is coming to save you, and I've got all the time in the world. I'll be back. Alone." Lucas left her without a backwards glance, muttering darkly as he let the cell door close behind him. She threw herself at the door after him, but it locked automatically as it closed. Panic rose like bile in her throat, and the edges of her vision darkened. Her eyes darted from one corner of the sterile metal cell to another. He would be back, and there was no way she would face him again unarmed. The room was bare, completely unfurnished besides the ropes and hood that lay in a pile in the center of the room. She picked the hood up and threw it roughly at the wall. She fought the urge to scream as it slid to the ground with an unsatisfyingly soft thump. There had to be some way to prepare herself for his next visit. Eden wasn't ready to sink to the floor in defeat yet. Another deep breath steadied her, and her vision cleared, but her stomach rolled. She stumbled and threw her hands out to steady herself again. Her fingers caught at the seam between two sheets of metal. It was loose, the bolts too old and rusted to hold the sheets together securely. Eden pulled at the seam again, digging her fingers between the two sheets until the seam was coated in blood but wiggling freely, a large piece almost coming loose in her hands. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on." With a primal grunt, Eden tore the piece of the lower sheet of metal away, revealing only the solid dirt wall behind it. She hefted the piece of metal, about as long as her forearm and half as wide. The edge was ragged and rusted where it had broken apart from the rest of the siding, and smeared with streaks of her blood. It was light, and Eden tested it by swinging it over her head once and then again. She winced as the edge bit into her hand again, but she was able to keep hold. It wasn't much, Eden realized as she settled on the floor of her cell with her makeshift weapon behind her back. It was all she had. It would have to be enough. Eden leaned her head back against the cool steel of the wall and waited. All she could do was wait. Rory didn't sleep that night. He roamed the grid of streets through Haven, one by one, until the sun glimmered over the glass of the dome and his exhausted legs could carry him no further. He knew it was pointless, even as he forced his blistered feet forward. The city of Haven had been embarrassingly ineffectual at rooting out the hive. Until recently, some had believed the terror cell to be a rumor intended to enforce an unspoken curfew. That idea, though more comforting than reality, had burnt out quickly as the hive's activity picked up over the years. Where could they hide? Rory paused on the street corner to let the light morning traffic pass. There weren't too many places to hide in Haven. The common theory at this stage was that they operated a moving base, never staying in one quadrant of the city for long, always one step ahead of the city police. Cardinal Enterprises cards were no more useful when it came to rooting out the infestation. If anything, the advent of the private security force had only served to make the hive more aggressive. Rory didn't bother to look both ways as he crossed the street with a small throng of fellow pedestrians. To his knowledge, the disappearances hadn't started until the cards had become a permanent part of the Cardinal Enterprises offerings. He rubbed his eyes tiredly. Campus wasn't far away, but it might as well have been miles for the aching in his legs. Immediately, he was struck with guilt. He was tired, he was blistered, his legs were sore. It paled in comparison to whatever Eden was going through. She wasn't dead, he realized. She couldn't be. He would know. There were a lot of people who whispered about what happened to those taken by the hive. Rory pushed all those thoughts out of his mind. Eden was alive, and she was waiting for him to find her. His phone buzzed, and he jumped, scrambling to answer it. "It's her. It's her. Have you heard anything?" It was Silas Cooper. His desperation was palpable through the screen, though perhaps that was Rory's own reflected back at him. "Nothing yet," he replied. "None of the neighbors have heard either. We've reported to the city. Stay in touch, son." Rory stared at the words until they swam through the tears in his eyes. He tucked the phone into his pocket and wiped the moisture from his eyes as he climbed the campus steps. He ached to return to his dorm, walk past the cursed work that was likely waiting there for him, and climb into his bed. Maybe when he woke, the nightmare would have passed. Maybe when he woke, everything would be right again. Instead, Rory passed the elevators and continued down the hall to the last door at the end. The door was slightly ajar. Through it, he could see that Mara was hard at work in her office. The dark furniture and low lighting was a welcome relief to his tired eyes. She was sitting at the desk, hunched over her computer screen, but her eyes flicked up when he entered through her open door. "What do you need?" she asked, looking back at her screen. "It's about Eden." Mara looked up from her screen and seemed to see Rory for the first time. The permanent scowl on her face softened as she looked at him. Pity. He didn't want her pity. He could only imagine how haggard and rough he looked. He needed her help. The city police were worse than useless, and, in his eyes and in the eyes of the company, he knew this was a Cardinal Enterprises matter. "You look like shit. Come in," Mara said, "and shut the door behind you." He did as she asked and perched on the edge of the chair across from her. There was no point beating around the bush, and Mara wouldn't tolerate it if he did. He tried to pretend that the captain of the cards did not slightly terrify him, but that was only possible because every ounce of his fear was centered on Eden. He tried to organize everything in his mind into some kind of coherent thought, but every time he opened his mouth, nothing intelligible came out. "Spit it out," Mara snapped. "Tell me what you need to tell me, or get out and let me get back to work." Rory took a deep breath. There was no way to say it to make it better, to make it more palatable. Why was this harder than telling Silas? Why did reporting this to Mara make it feel so real, so final, so crushing? Eden is missing. No one has heard from her since the night before last. The last time I saw her was at the garden the night of the festival. The night of the festival? And you're sure no one has heard from her? She's not answering any of my calls, and her room is untouched. She hasn't been there. "I don't think she ever made it back to campus," Rory said, as quickly as he could, as though that would lessen the hurt. "It didn't. She's missing. Have you talked to her parents? Maybe they've heard from her." "They haven't heard from her either. She didn't show up for work yesterday. They have her, Mara. They got her. Didn't they?" "Slow down," Mara said, not unkindly but without any unnecessary measure of comfort. "I'll make the report. You're right, okay? Keep it together, at least while you're in my office. But you're probably right. If she's missing, it will be the work of the hive." "If," Mara grimaced in response. She began typing on her keyboard, and her eyes moved back to her computer screen. After a few moments, she looked up at Rory. "Is there something else I can do for you? Is that it?" Rory asked, trying to keep from leaping out of his chair and shouting at her. "I've added her to the list of the missing. Right at the top," she said. "The report's been made. I assume the city has been notified as well?" "Excellent. You've done everything you can, Dr. Lawrence." Rory couldn't listen any more. Mara's words were distant, hidden beneath the angry buzzing of the noise in his head. The lights were too bright. His necktie was too tight. His hands, he realized, were damp. He got up from the chair and, in his haste to escape, almost sent it flying over behind him. "Settle down, Lawrence. I've never seen you this worked up." Hal's voice was loud, grating, and instantly recognizable, even through the haze of Rory's headspace. The last thing he needed was to be stuck in Hal's vile presence, but there he stood, leaning in the doorway, with his usual smug expression. "Take it easy, Hal," Mara said from her desk. "Dr. Lawrence was just leaving." Hal, being Hal, had no intention of letting it drop. That much was obvious by his face. Rory clenched his fists and shoved them into the pockets of his jacket. Everything seemed to be moving in slow motion, and all he knew was that he needed to leave. "Quickly. What's got you so riled up?" Hal asked. "Giving Mara a hard time?" "That's enough," Mara said. "Eden Cooper is our latest victim. She's just been added to the list of the missing. She's been missing since the night before last." Hal didn't look at all repentant. If anything, his smirk only deepened. Rory's nails earned a drop of blood from his palms as he clenched his fists harder. How many times had Eden spent an afternoon in his old office at the city centre, telling him about some altercation or another she'd had with Hal Cook? More than he could count. They'd been fairly good friends in school, competing together on the shooting team and running track in the summers. It hadn't always been like this. Rory had never been privy to exactly whatever had gone down between Eden and Hal in junior high, when things had started to change. He knew that Hal had asked Eden on a date, which she had refused. Likely in her too blunt way, Rory had assumed at the time. He knew that Hal had never looked at Eden the same, or Rory for that matter. Rory felt his heart fill with fire to think of it. Was that what this was? A childhood broken heart that had a grown man standing before them, smirking at the disappearance of the brightest woman in the city? "You sure she's missing, and not just branching out?" Rory could only stare at him blankly. If he moved, he would surely swing at the man, and that would do no good. Still, it was a tempting prospect. "What are you talking about?" Mara asked. She slid her chair back, as if anticipating a need to get up and put herself between the two men in her office. "I think his girlfriend just moved on. I saw her leaving the garden last night with some guy. Maybe she's still at his place." Hal seemed to relish the thought, and he winked at Rory. That was more than enough. Rory wasn't even sure what he was doing as he stepped forward. He'd never been in a fight, unless he counted all the ones Eden had rescued him from when they were children. Luckily, Mara was faster than Rory, and she stepped between them. "Take a step back, Lawrence," she said. Rory would have been offended, had Mara's tone not become considerably sharper as she turned to Hal. "Some guy. Who? What did you see?" Hal put his hands up in a gesture of mock surrender. "I didn't see who. Some guy. He certainly wasn't dragging her. She left with him." "She would have said something," Rory snapped. "She would have answered. She's been taken, and I'm losing hope by the second, knowing that you are the ones looking for her." Rory shoved past him, deaf to his laughter and Mara's shout, out into the hallway. his vision darkening around the edges and his heart beating into overdrive. He never should have left Eden alone in the garden. Not for any meeting. He should have insisted or refused to leave without her. Rory threw himself into the elevator and sank to the floor as the doors closed around him, mercifully alone. He never should have left her. He sank his face into his hands. It was his fault. Mara was probably already deleting Eden's name from the list of the missing. When the doors opened, Rory pulled himself to his feet and wiped his eyes. His phone beeped in his pocket and he flinched. Did he dare to hope? Conference room C. 15 minutes. Shit, Rory muttered. Another meeting. You're late, Sabrina whispered when Rory robotically lowered himself into the seat beside her, barely giving her enough time to move her briefcase. Are you okay? Dr. Abrahams had already started his meeting. He glowered at Rory as the conference room door swung shut, announcing his lateness more loudly than he'd expected. Sorry, everyone. Please continue, Rory said, softly to Sabrina. No, I'm not. As I was saying, Project Tai Chi is on track to be a success. Dr. Harper, the code I've received from you has been stellar. Dr. Lawrence, I assume you'll have completed your assignment before the end of the day. Maybe it was because he was running on empty, without food or sleep or care for himself. Maybe it was the twist in his stomach at the thought of being a part of the team that shattered the treaty, on top of everything else. Without Eden, what did any of it matter? Whatever it was, Rory could be silent no longer. Have any of us considered what breaking the treaty will mean? He asked. Have we really considered the repercussions of this? Abrahams glowered at him. We've discussed this already, Dr. Lawrence. The treaty will not stop Cardinal Enterprises from dragging this city into the future, farther than our sister cities could ever hope to do. No one else has the bravery. Cardinal Enterprises is bound by no treaty. You know as well as I do that the distinction won't matter to anyone but you. The capital and our sister cities will see this as a breach of the treaty. Something changed in the air of the already quiet room. Every eye darted between Abrahams and Rory, both stony-faced and unyielding. There would be consequences for this, Rory knew. He didn't care what happened to himself anymore. To his surprise, Dr. Abrahams didn't shout or eject him from the room. He straightened his suit jacket, the lines impeccable, and smiled coolly at Rory. I'm surprised you can't see the value in this project, Dr. Lawrence. If you'd rather be removed from this task force than search for your friend, so be it. Rory's heart went from racing to nearly stopped. What do you mean? Abrahams looked smug, but it was Sabrina who jumped in. Her voice was quick and nervous, almost apologetic at first. Rory, I'm sorry, but when you were late, I thought that you might not show up at all. I told Dr. Abrahams about your friend. But don't you see, Rory? This satellite is going to be the beginning of a new era of safety for all of Haven. With the Tai Chi watching over us from above, the Hive will have nowhere to hide. Part of my assignment was a heat signature detection program. Wherever they are in the city, we'll be able to flush them out, stomp them out for good. No more missing, no more attacks on our crops or storage centers. A safer city. A happier city. This is a good thing, Rory. Let Dr. Abrahams worry about the treaty, but he's already assured us that this is no breach. Okay. Rory closed his eyes, painfully aware of the rest of the room watching them. Maybe she was right. Damn the treaty, if it would stand in the way of something that would bring Eden home. Wasn't it worth it, to risk it all to bring her home? She's right, Dr. Lawrence, Dr. Whitmore said. When the cities agreed to the treaty, they had no idea the dangers we'd be facing from within our own dome. It's a pity that it has come to rest on our shoulders to make a stand, but who could begrudge us this? You really think they'll understand? Building the Tai-Chi, launching her, using the paradisium? Truly! Rory shook his head, dumbfounded. It all felt unreal. Everything was colliding in his brain, and nothing made sense anymore. Dr. Lawrence, I will ask you once to trust me. Do you want to find your friend, and the rest of the missing, or not? Or do you want to leave them in the hands of the hive, where stars know what is happening to them? Rory swallowed nervously and tried to sound more confident than he was. I want to help, Dr. Abrahams.